everyone, and welcome to this weekly call today with Daniel Crystal Wahl, and we will keep it as informal as possible.
First of all, thank you so much, everybody, for making time, because it's really a gift to be given the attention of this next hour, so we can have a conversation together. And also, I feel touched by reading what you wrote together about looking at my work, and I'm sure that it will also help me reflect in the future about how I communicate my work. So there was so much there that I feel tempted to sort of bring up a little bit of what you wrote together as a way of stimulating you or your questions afterwards to say what you really want to tunnel in more deeply. And I mean, the first area of how do we change belief systems from one old belief system to a new belief system. So much is wound up in that. And sometimes I personally wonder, and I really would love to stay more in the space of what you make me reflect upon rather than tell you what I think the right answer is, because I think that's part of the point, is that if we let go a little bit of this idea that we're moving from one thing to another, if we let go of the idea that we're seeking an ultimate truth that needs to be established and that we all need to agree upon, and why don't they see it, and why are they still in the old belief system and not in the new belief system, I think that is part of the perpetuation of that other way of being that produces another way of seeing and brings forth the world that we then, like some of the stuff you wrote was this sort of the monolith that can't be moved, and all this issue that came up around them and us. I actually think that all of those are just emergent properties of a way of seeing the world and a way of being in the world, and an underlying narrative. So more and more I dislike the framing of a paradigm shift, because it tends to then be framed in a dualist from this to that. And it seems to suggest that we need to get everybody to agree. But maybe what it really is about is to get less focused on somebody having the truth, and more focused on the process of inquiry, of together finding out how to participate appropriately in ways that we actually future rather than defuture. Our current civilization, simply in its behavioral pattern, is running against the wall. And so some of the issues that raise of, like, how do you raise certain issues without, like there was also mentioned in your paper, let me just quote it so I can find it. Introduce ideas in a non-threatening way. This needs to be nuanced. Of course, one thing that doesn't serve is to say, you evil tech industry, you evil fossil fuel industry, you evil pharma industry, and create an other and somebody to fight against. But to name certain practices that don't have a future, or actually stealing future from future generations of human beings and the rest of life, also we need to just clearly name them, because there are some biophysical realities around how our species has lost fit with the biological patterns that sustain life on a planetary system like the biosphere that we're part of. And some of the other things that you raised in this 5-page reflection on my work was this: what does the biological lens not see? And does it exclude social? Does it exclude political issues, race issues? What I'm trying to invite people into is a remembering that the biological lens is not a lens, but it's a biophysical reality. We are biological beings. And social systems and complex technological systems and all the systems we've created and innovated are metaphenomena, are emergent properties of this biophysical system. But the minute we stop being attuned to life, we're running against the wall. There was also some mention of 3 types of intelligence, like human intelligence, technological intelligence, and nature intelligence. And I'm wondering, and this is just a reflection, do these categories serve, or are these categories in and of themselves not already conceptual frames that separate? Because ultimately humans are part of nature, and even if we really want to understand this biophysical totality, a constantly transforming whole that is only separating itself to be able to perceive itself from within, which is this participatory, interconnected awareness of what brings us forth, the living process, life. Our mental frames separate us out from that, but we're not separate from it. And the way to reintegrate into it, and this, while this is and sounds very conceptual, because it's so upstream from the design process that then shapes how we see the world, what we perceive as needs, how we then create designs to answer those needs. It's just going up the river to rejig how we bring forth the world in language, in narrative, in a story of relationships. And once we work there, then all these, so many of the questions you brought forth actually show up as examples of a certain way of seeing. I mean, I don't know if you can see this. You probably all know this cube that depending on how you look at it, either the green face is in front or the red face is in front. It was used by Kuhn as an example of a paradigm shift. But I feel like it's to some extent about this shift in our way of being and seeing that then dissolves these issues of, like you're talking about leadership and beyond us versus them. Ultimately, if we truly understand the systemic biological lens, as it was named, then everything is nested within it. So it's not separate from social or political issues. And also this repeating question of, this sounds very nice in theory, but how does this work in practice? That's another false dualism right there. The dualism between theory and practice that we have used for decades now to make social change movements inactive, because there was always a fight between the philosophers and theoreticians, and I'm a practitioner, I'm an activist. But what is more changing the world than to activate new ideas in the mind of other peoples, to activate through questions, conversations that help people bring forth a new world? That is changing the world. That is just changing the world at a different level. And of course, it is dancing with complexity. It's not the kind of change of the world of, well, how will I be able to predict the outcomes, and what will my key performance indicators be, or how do I fit that into my theory of change? They're all useful ideas, but they're they're in themselves, again, expressions of trend tracking. And what I've come to experiment with and believe is that the way to solve all these issues that we're facing, because that was the other thing, how many issues is this lens leaving out? Well, my work tries to speak to potential rather than problems. I speak a lot about why change is necessary, and climate change and biodiversity loss and obscene levels of inequality financially, but also in terms of between genders and racial. All of these issues are critically important, but they're problems, they're symptoms of underlying causes. And I try to focus on the potential of us coming together in our diversity, not seeing diversity as the problem, but as the potential from which we can innovate, but still have enough And that's why I don't think biology is a lens, or the biophysical reality of being part of nature as embodied living beings that are not really separate from life. Because again, it's the story that we have that life is this group of individuals, but really life is primarily a planetary process. It shows up as individuals and species, but life over this whole evolution of life on Earth has created conditions conducive to life. And if you want it simple, the one thing that we need to do as human beings and as individuals is create conditions conducive to life. The way we can serve most our own individuality is to express it in context, in service to a higher self, not to a higher self, to a higher community, and the community that is not just human, but human and nature. And it's in this reperceiving that we're actually not separate, but that we're just expressions of this whole, and that we're dependent on it, and at the same time co-creating it, that gives us both enormous humility in the sense of, wow, like everything I do really matters, because whether I do something or don't do something, I'm intricately interlinked with everything else, and my actions shift the world and the future. But at the same time, it's also extremely what's the right word? Courageous or audacious to say, I can change the world. But the reality is we can. So it's this humility and audacity paradox that we get closer when we understand our participatory involvement in all of this. And just to make this more concrete, and then let's go over to question, because this sounded very high level. We were just talking, Juan Sebastian, who was in the group, and I about in the beginning before you showed up, and he was mentioning he's on a course, or he did a course with Gaia Education, who I worked for many years, on design for sustainability, because there was this question of how does all of this go into action, and I talked about how that's a false dualism. I think that course that Gaia Education created 12 years ago has transformed the world, because it reached maybe 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people around the world who were already willing to activate and take a role in community, and it gave them the tools to it didn't tell them what to do, but it mapped out a landscape of how to be of service at a bioregional and local scale and create regenerative patterns. And these people have formed networks in each country. There's somebody calling in from Brazil, and I'm sure you've heard of the Gaianos. There's a whole tribe across Brazil of people who've gone through this training, either the virtual one or the online one. And Juan's project in Colombia is an example of it. It's not here's just a 400-hour learning experience, and that sounds all very theoretical. No, it's actually a training, a capacity building for people to then go and try it out for themselves. And that's also why in my book I have 200 questions. I don't want to tell people what to do, but I, as a biologist, know that if we align with our larger being as life, we can create the social, ecological, and political conditions to make this transformation. And there was a question around why in my work, well, I'm leaving out the political, and that's we can go there, because I'm asking myself that sometimes too. And partially it's because I find it's very easy to get drawn into them against us conversation and be immediately pulled energetically into the problem-focused issue. But it is, I think, at the regional scale, and I'll end with this, and then we'll have a conversation. I think all of this can become relevant only if we apply it at the local and regional scale. The disconnection that we have with life's patterns of generating conditions conducive to life is that we have disconnected as humanity from those scale linking patterns that maintain health at the local, to maintain health at the bioregional or ecosystems level, and as a sum total, all of that then maintains health at the biospheric level. So life builds from the bottom up. Even health and wholeness is built from the bottom up in that way. And so the only way we can refit and do this, make it through this great transformation that is now ahead, is to invite this relocalization and re-regionalization process. And there was a lot of questions also around how do you work with corporates? And I do work with corporates, and they're not as unmovable as people think. I've just gone through 6 months of being extremely surprised by a company who I literally had a deep, long process to make sure whether I actually would want to work for that company. And then I immediately thought, wow, wait a minute, that's exactly the opportunity. You want to work with those that feel uncomfortable to work with, but you don't want to, you want to do it with integrity and speak truth. And if that means that you only work for them for a few days because they don't want to hear it, then that's fine. But if they want to hear it, then you work for them for longer. And I have seen a company in the extractive industries move towards a vision of ultimately transforming not just their business model, but what they would do as a company and how they would exist and how they would literally do what we're all called to do now. Joanna Macy's beautiful image of being hospice workers and midwives at the same time. They were applying that, or their commitment is applying that to their own company of hospicing their current manifestation out of existence to midwife into a global bioregional network of collaborative, more community and ecosystems engaged and place-sourced novel companies that are linked by global collaboration. And for me, that pattern is the transformation that the corporate sector will have to go through. It's away from too big not to fail and towards decentralized, bioregionally focused, regenerative business models. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. I opened up a shed lot of boxes, and you can ask questions.
Daniel, thank you so much for your writing. It's really inspirational. I'm working on climate change in the food and agriculture sector. And my background could roughly be described as a food systems designer. What I find challenging is, and I'm using spiral dynamics as a metaphor to explain, is the communication of a message, a story that translates up and down the spiral, so that there is coherence in the message and in the story, but it's understood on each, I don't want to say level, but let's say in each color, so that it is context specific, because we need to change behavior. We need to induce behavioral changes on the public side, which then will drive a change in demand on the corporate structure and link with the production side, the farmer. That is what I find so challenging, because not only is the story currently not cohesive up and down the spiral, it is also being purposefully disrupted. So it has to push through these disruptions. Does that make some sense?
Wow. Wow. You opened up a hell of a lot of really interesting things there. Also, I'd love to follow up maybe in May or something, because I'm actually just starting work with a UK multi-university collaborative long-term project on a regenerative food system for the UK, and we haven't even started yet, but it would be interesting to have your opinion on it. But for me, what you brought up links to that first question in the summary of like, how do you get people to change belief systems, and that ultimately would drive behavioral change. It's so right that we need to find multiple stories that all express the underlying same thread. So as you move in a healthy human development, you move through the spiral. You can activate in a positive expression each spiral, like each level of the spiral towards that new story. And I agree. I don't think we've fully articulated it yet, but I think that the food system conversation, once you mix it with the localization, community, and bioregional and ecosystems restoration conversation, and the SDG implementation conversation, it has enough requisite variety and diversity to actually speak to people at different levels of the spiral. I love that for those who haven't come across this, what Klaus was just speaking to is quite nicely articulated in an article by Barrett Brown that he wrote in Cosmos Journal in 2009. If you just put Cosmos Journal, Barrett Brown, communicating sustainability, PDF, it should pop up. And in it, he speaks to exactly that like he based on the work of Zimmerman and Esbjørn Hagens, he speaks to these differences, the eco-activist, the eco-warrior, the eco-manager, and how they all have hot and cold buttons that will immediately give them an opportunity to other you and put you in a box and stop listening. So I always found it a really useful little rubric to go over before meeting certain audiences. But I think that the minute we localize the conversation, and food, I think, is such a powerful entry into this conversation about health of people, of the land, of the landscape and the ecosystem, the connection between farmers and their community, how we made the primary sector unimportant in economics. It's so central to give farmers the place in society that they really deserve, not just as the producers of food, but also as the guardians of landscape health, and the need to collaborate around that. But I think that through the regionalization conversation about how do we heal our local ecosystems to heal the planet, how do we bring all this pandemic has done is to make us realize how brittle global systems practices actually are. And it has brought a lot of people back into their relationship with the local farmers for a short while. And in taking that opportunity to really create community-supported agriculture, bioregionally focused farming systems that are regenerative, where people know that if I pay more for this food, in 10 years' time, there will be forests where there aren't right now. And I live here, so it matters to me immediately. It speaks to many more levels of the spiral than the kind of we need to reforest because we need to save the planet conversation. So yeah, I'll stop so I can have another question.
So I'm just thinking out loud, but as you're speaking, I'm wondering about what I'll call resource entrapment, and specifically looking through the university or where we put our resources and even our science. So as an example, when a student goes to study, there's like an ag center here with UC Berkeley, right? When you go there to study, and I'll use an example of a particular student that I met with a handful of years ago, you find out this is the game we're playing here. This is what the funding is for. And it's a way that truly derails a lot of the idealism that shows up. So the example is a young lady named Alexandra that I met with, and she came in as somebody really interested in whole body health and yoga and nutrition, and she came into the nutrition PhD program at Berkeley. And she's like, my God, I can't believe that they're trying to have me do research on targets for diabetic drugs when they should look at what we're eating, right? So what about this? I think that's why the question of politics probably was a thread in the questions posed, because where the resources are the game that we play. And if you have young people that are idealistic, especially in the university system, in the system of creating new systems and new ag practices, et cetera, at scale, the game we play is what creates the direction they end up going in.
Absolutely, it's so important, and thanks for mentioning that, because it's also very closely linked with how many. If you write a research grant about how to offer an alternative pathway in any area where we're currently going completely wrong, if you don't add lots of high tech and techie stuff, you're not going to get the grant, because again, that's where the resources are flowing. For me, I think we need a much more nuanced conversation about technology, how to make technology truly serve humanity rather than humanity serve technology, which is where we're going rapidly. And I know so many people in the Bay Area who, on the one hand, see this kind of dystopian material of every sci-fi of the last 30 years literally playing out. Like, we create our own reality, and so we're basically creating that techno-dystopian world, and even sell it as a utopian world that, of course, even our anyway, I'm going into the side trap of the technology conversation here, but back to the universities also. I feel that the universities currently have maximum 10 years to completely and utterly reinvent themselves to be relevant in this world. And I think this is going to increasingly become visible to them, and some universities are already understanding that. And for me, the one way that universities and because that was the other thing in your narrative that I was sent, there was a lot of this questioning of, well, some people just like to talk economics, and some people just like to talk sociology, and some people, well, of course, we've been trained to do that, but what would an education system look like that would actually show us that all of these are connected? Sir Patrick Geddes, more than 110 years ago, was a biologist who is also the founder of sociology and town planning, and he coined the word think global, act local. He was completely aware of the social divide in Edinburgh, where he taught in Dundee and lived in Edinburgh. He invented the first student union in order to regenerate the slum that is now the old town of Edinburgh. He lived with the low lives and helped them do urban gardens and paint the walls and make the gray-black place a little more bright and green. And this is 120 years ago. So there are patterns of if you align with life and you tell a narrative of how we all fit together, like Geddes 100 years ago created a museum that the people of Edinburgh could walk into, and on the ground floor they would have an exhibition of the world, and the second floor up it was exhibition of Europe, and then an exhibition of the United Kingdom, and then an exhibition of Scotland, and on the top floor they had a camera obscura, which 100 years ago was super high tech, that projected the city of Edinburgh onto the ceiling of that room in the top floor. And in one little museum journey, a cultural, social journey, he's implanted a seed that we live in a nested wholeness, that our identity is both planetary and extremely local. And because of that nested wholeness, when we begin to see those truly biological, biophysical realities, then we can bring in these different narratives, like Klaus was saying. And I mean, I'm seeing it right now with working in the bioregionals regeneration space. I feel it's uncomfortable that every now and then I bump into people that are very strong bioregionalists, but in a kind of creating a lifeboat, us against them, we need to close the borders for our bioregion. But again, I can see that in this honoring diversity, working with the impulse that people are coming back to the region, and then always naming that this kind of parochial, them against us lifeboat bioregionalism is not the way we can heal the planet and co-create a viable future. But once we understand the biophysical connection from local to global, it becomes a cosmopolitan bioregionalism that says, yes, it's all only going to be meaningful if we do it in our place, in our region together. At that level of complexity, we can deal with the real difference of opinions, the real industries that need to be hospiced and the new ones that need to be midwifed. We stop that global conversation that where's the blueprint, where's the thing that we can write down and then make everybody apply. It has to be, that's why my book has a plural in it, and it's vitally important. Regenerative cultures come out of place. There have to be different expressions of each place, because it's very much the notion that the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land. The land will be here many, many eons when we all have long melted back into it and become fertilizer. So it's another one of those false ideas that we own land. And in that sense, regenerative cultures become regenerative expressions of the ecosystem. They're not separate from it. Sorry, I kind of got into a bit of a spiel there. More questions?
I'm from Mauritius, in case you want to know. Very small island off the coast of Madagascar, 600 kilometers from Madagascar to the east. I'm actually involved in one small project, permaculture project, and we have a situation in Mauritius where at one point in time, the dominant industry was agriculture and mainly sugarcane, which were exported to Europe and partly to US. And then gradually, we lost many of the concessions that we had in Europe, and a lot of the sugarcane plantation had to be abandoned. Now, the large estates, the large planters, they converted to shopping malls, to residential, and all kinds of things. But we're left with a lot of small planters owning very small plots, maybe 1 acre, 3 acres, 6 acres, things like that. We have maybe 5,000 to 6,000 planters like that. And for me to start my project, I had to buy 6 different small plots to make up 6 acres of land, just to give you an idea. So my worry is that how you eventually, and all these small planters have abandoned their sugarcane plantations, just lying like that. And how can I, with my project, reach out to all these people out there and create awareness of what we can do with the land, how we can regenerate the land, and how can we eventually join together? Is there a way of doing it? Is there a tool of doing it that you project one project like that? I'm not the only one. There are maybe 5, 6 people who started doing it. But how we connect and how we sensitize all the other people and trying to make a sufficiently big project which can have an impact on the environment. Because these small projects, definitely, we can't do much with that. All right?
Yes, that sounds super interesting. I like because it's a lovely specific case. But it is also a general case. It's happening in so many other places as well. Like I know stories in Japan, for example, where a lot of people have left the rural areas to live in the cities, and there are some eco-villages that are there's a farming eco-village I'm thinking of that is basically working the land of other people under an agreement, a legal agreement, and that working the land organically is keeping up the fences, is keeping the land in good conditions, is stopping pests grow. It basically increases the value of the land rather than decreases it. So the owners are happy that without getting anything for it, they also at least don't have to pay for the uptake. And then they can have the guarantee that they can have it back within one harvest cycle. So they have to give notice. And if the crop is still on the ground, then they get it back after that crop has been harvested, and no strings attached, so to speak. And that's a very practical example that you get here on Mallorca. There's also an organization called Banco de Tierras, a land bank, where that is simply an organization that has that speaks, again, two languages, like Klaus said. It speaks to the owners of the land, saying, do you want to make sure that your land doesn't get squatted on, or get people fly dump toxic waste on your land, or that your fences break down and animals invade and all this kind of stuff? Well, here's a group of people who actually want land, and they're going to do it for you. You're not going to get anything for it, but at least you know your land is going to get taken care of. And when you need your land back or you want to sell it, all you have to do is to tell them that. Another organization, because this is a central question, and it's so aligned to what I was saying earlier. Like, I wasn't saying that lightly, that more and more, like, I had this, it kind of landed physically in my body while I was talking to John Fullerton on Zoom a few, like maybe a year and a half ago. I heard myself say that, yeah, it really all comes down to this ancient indigenous knowledge that the land does not belong to us, we belong to the land. And I suddenly sat there and it was like, whoa. Like, you know how sometimes something just grows in your lap and like, it was a physical experience of I believe that is at the heart of it. And I don't believe that means that we're going to undo private land ownership from now until tomorrow, not even in 10 years, and possibly not even fully in 100 years or 150 years. But that doesn't mean that we can't create structures, and this is beginning to happen now, where all over the world people are creating these regenerative land trusts in different business models, where people who don't have children, or people who don't know what to do with their land, or people who have inherited so much that they feel that the responsibility is too much to bear, can put their land into a regenerative land trust that people can then live on and have tenure on over generations, as long as they commit that they manage the land regeneratively in perpetuity. And so the oversight of the trust's only job is to ensure that regeneration is taking place rather than degeneration. And I mean, a friend of mine, Claudian Dobosch, is working on this. I think it's called Terra Libre. I'll try to remember all these references and send them to Fyodor to send to you afterwards. But yeah, that I would encourage you on Mauritius, and you probably know my friend Anne-Loes Schmitzman. Like, I've been to Mauritius. I don't normally drink much, but I remember that the best rum I've ever tried came from Mauritius, and it had a beautiful Mark Twain quote on the bottle.
God created Mauritius first.
and
then copied.
And Mauritius was a paradise, and the opportunity of islands. I live on an island because I decided that we need models for bioregional regeneration, and at that scale, we're in a level of complexity that is so complex that nobody can do linear type of work with that. You can't go and say, here's the plan for the bioregion, let's implement it. But I wanted to see, how can you seed through education and little projects, how can you seed different ways of thinking and simply contribute to positive emergence at a bioregional scale? And that's what I've been trying to do here on Mallorca for 10 years. And I think on Mauritius, you have the same opportunity. And another aspect of that is to pay attention to the kind of currencies that are now under development, like in the Regen network. They're looking at a way of paying farmers not just for their produce, but also for the regenerative impact on their land. And the same, there's this new currency called seeds that is trying to fund regeneration. And these kind of projects you're speaking of, particularly if you also look at cooperative ownership and how to, like, either build a land trust or bring all of these small landowners into a cooperative. Cooperative business models are the fastest growing business models in the world. That is the business model for the future. So anyway, the next person was
Joshua.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Daniel.
Go.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for the work that you've been putting out in the world. I guess, I don't know if it's a question, it's kind of a comment. I think I was surprised on Wednesday at the very end, we kind of, we had a lot of interesting discussions, and we talked about, reflected on how the work that you were doing is kind of reflecting with what's going on in our lives. At the end, 4 people described kind of, they had been the hosts and they described what was going on in their groups. And there was quite a bit of leaning on this agency. And it felt like there was maybe a lack of agency or a feeling of agency within the group. And I think that, so I think what you said at the beginning, where the philosopher being able to philosophize around certain topics is actually also an act of changing. And I think the COVID has kind of locked us down and made circles like this really easy and accessible. And so people come in and they're sharing really ideas with other people who are really enthusiastic about doing same things, but it's like, okay, we want to break out and we want to use these ideas and spread them. And it's kind of still like pent up energy. And I've seen that in 2 ways in my own life. So it's like also, but then when I get the opportunity to be in interaction with people, the ideas that I've been feeling and philosophizing about come out differently. They're clunky. They're not lived. They're like still floating in my head. So I guess maybe that's an easier way for me to. What would be suggestions for you to embody kind of the language that we have been maybe learning in groups like this, and to be able to bring it to people who are not so, maybe haven't spent so much time with ideas of regeneration or.
Yeah, I mean, first let me agree with you on how this opportunity. I mean, of course, it's challenging many people in many ways, and it's also driven us into the technological space even faster, even further. But it seems to be opening up, like the COVID and the pandemic is what I'm speaking about, and how at least some part of the world, privileged people like us, are responding to it. I think it will be much easier to live rurally in a smaller community and still do a meaningful and maybe even well-paid job in other systems after this, because the teleworking will be so much more acceptable. And what I find, and this is a practical embodied experience, like I've learned a lot through the practice of the way of counsel, which is a really ancient indigenous practice of simply sitting in the circle as human beings, showing up as who we are, not as the roles and the accolades we carry. And then opening up with a question, and with the simple rules of listening from the heart, speaking from the heart, keeping it to the essence, so not going on when it's not necessary, and being spontaneous, to let this process develop and really be present with each and every one as they speak to the question and what the question is moving in them as a human being, not what they think about it, but and as we do this, and first I thought it's not possible in the Zoom space. I thought it needs to be in sacred circle on a nice piece of land around the candle or whatever. But you can actually do it in Zoom too. Every person opening up a little bit further of, are we crazy? What are we doing with this world? I'm in pain to see what we're doing to the thread that has brought us forth, or whatever people are saying. You hear them voice realities that for many people have been hidden secretly in them for many, many years. They've not found anybody to share that with. And in that moment, there's a healing going on that makes you realize, I'm not crazy. There are other people just as crazy as me around these issues. And with everybody who dares to just open up, show their vulnerability, show their doubt, show their insecurity, but also show their passion for life and their love for life and the things that move them and that give them joy. It creates a spiral, and every person gives the next person a permission to go deeper. And the reason I bring this up is that at the end of these processes, and indigenous people all over the world have had these processes to make important decisions. But it's a Western thing to think that at the end of the council, after 90 minutes, you go, okay, what's the action plan? And what's the next milestone? And what did we just come up with? No, you've just opened up your awareness of what's in the room and what everybody brings to this issue in such a multitude of ways that you will act differently because you've been sitting in that council. Like that's the other bit, is like the theory and practice false dualism makes everybody believe that right now we're just sitting here having a conversation, and we either learn something here and then do something with it out in the world, or we don't, and then this has had no efficacy whatsoever. I don't believe that. I think that we're right now changing the world. We're rewiring reality in our own spaces, in the conversation, in living the questions together. That's why, again, bringing it one more time back to that, I think by shifting, and it doesn't mean that we don't need to find solutions, and it doesn't mean that we don't need to give answers. It also doesn't mean that everybody is right. Like a fascist is still a fascist, a racist is still a racist, a bigot is still a bigot. But if we live the questions together, we don't pretend that solutions and answers are final and that questions are only transient means to get to these solutions and answers. We actually flip it around, and we understand that everything is a prototype. Everything is just trying it out, getting feedback, and then doing it differently the next time, hopefully having learned something. So that questions are much more important. And this kind of practice is done much more easily in a complex society like ours, with a focus on a particular bioregion in a particular locality in a particular community. All the evil monsters still show up of people not disagreeing and people not following through what they're saying they will do, and all of that. And we still have to learn how to work with that. Sociocracy and all these techniques, nonviolent communications, and processes-oriented psychology work, Thomas Hubel's work with fields, social fields, all of that is exploring what I would call part of they're all blossoms of the regenerative cultures that we're now bringing forth. The peer-to-peer movement, we're just, it's like the jewel net of Indra that is reflecting itself, and each one of us is just beaming out one of those reflections, but they're beginning to coalesce. But it doesn't mean that we need to know what the bigger picture is. We just need to play our part, I think. Anyway, there was one more. Zen, I don't want to.
Yes, Daniel, hello, and thank you very much for the work you're doing. The quick question that came up for me when you were talking about beliefs forming or initiating behavior, I would posit that the opposite could be true as well. And the reason I say that is that professionally, I'm a facilitator for team building of construction teams on multi-million-dollar projects. So I'm the one that stands in the middle of chaos and creates order. And it's through that kind of refocusing. There's no ego without we-go is one of the phrases that I use. There's another one I call jobarchy. Job's the boss and everybody wins. So everything is focused. And so in your question of, the council, and then boiling it down to, okay, what's our action plan? Well, here, what I do is actually an experiment that I've been doing for a couple of decades to see how well I can integrate the esoteric with the practical and get these left brain construction guys to actually engage in conversations to do so. And I think the same kind of process, right? Because it's the process that runs through it all, right? It's like the river. And so how do you see that kind of process being able to be utilized, activated? Granted, it's an art to be able to do so. I thought it was everybody could do it because it was something I was experiencing. I enjoyed doing, even with the tenuousness sometimes when you have egos that are wanting their own way and you've got to refocus them back on the common goal. So how would you see something like that, or even skill set utility happening to facilitate that bridge between the council and the practical and pragmatic action plans?
Thank you. That also, because like, again, it highlighted just me going into that whole council conversation. It's so easy to tell a story in a way that then seems like I made a sort of, our action plans aren't important, but that's not what I was trying to say. It's just that,
I know that.
they don't come out at the end of a council, but the council still has had a huge efficacy. But you're also speaking to something that's really nice to highlight, because a lot of energy is flowing into this term regeneration right now. And what's happening with it is the same thing that happened with circular and with smart and with what else? Lean, integral, a whole bunch of very intelligent, very capable, agile, socially connected and outgoing consultant trainer types repeat their habit of scanning what's new, what's important, doing a burst of learning up on it, and then packaging it in their little sort of, here's my offer, now you can be regenerative too. And the reality is that there's been over 25, 30 years, groups of people really deepening this, what does it mean to work regeneratively? And I honestly, when I brought out my book in 2016, I knew of some of their work, but not the depth of all of their work, like the Regenesis group and also Carol Sanford's work. And the reason why I'm bringing it up is partially because you talk about the construction industry. And the interesting thing is that when Carol Sanford, who actually worked with somebody called Charlie Crone for many years, that did large business transformation of Pacific Bell and like really big companies. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the tools, not just from him, from many others that Carol has integrated, come from quite an esoteric school, from like they use the Enneagram and all sorts of, and a lot of the actually what I find, as a side note, won't go down that rabbit hole, but I found it really interesting that yet again there's a lineage to J.G. Bennett and Gurdjieff that I've come across 3 or 4 times in my life where something really shifted my thinking, and when I dug deeper, I ended up with those guys. But what Pamela Mang eventually met Ben Haggard about 25 or some years ago, or 30 years ago, and they formed the Regenesis group. And when they decided, how do we, like, Ben came more from a permaculture, ecosystems restoration, landscape healing, that kind of work, but also had connections in Reiki and was actually an artist. And when he saw what Pamela was doing with corporations and large organizations and so on, using that lineage of Charlie Crone, they created Regenesis Institute, Regenesis group, and they focused on the built environment and developers. And in their work, another name that comes to mind is a guy called Jason Twill, who was key in helping to set up the Living Building Challenge, and Bill Reed helped with the Green Building Council. So there's a very close link between the built environment and this regenerative practice. And some of the tools that I've learned since then from them, they're reframing some things that I've been working with myself. I find their language a little bit obscure, but they do it on purpose in order to not be misunderstood. The language is such that you really have to inquire into it. But it is one of the strap lines, which is really powerful, is this moving from problems to potential. And you named another few that you use when you hold that space. And you're absolutely right. It's an apprenticeship. It's a lifelong path to learn this quality that you've obviously mastered doing what you're doing. What it brought up for me is in the International Futures Forum, we often say the quality of the intervener affects the quality of the intervention. And that's like it. Maybe one place to stop is that regenesis is also one of the key principles of regenerative practice, is that it's a 3-layer or 3 levels of work. The first level is personal development. The second level is capacity building of the team that you're going to do the job with, that you're creating a field, a way of working, a way of seeing even, and a way of listening to place, drawing out of place, out of the story of place and culture, which is where it meets very much from living the questions in all my work. And then only when you've built the basis of those first level work, second level work, then you engage with the job, the bioregional transformation, the building project, the changing the monetary system, or whatever it is.
Right.
And for me, the last bit to show, because this is the other bit that is currently so ripe, and that was also briefly addressed in your summary reflections, is rightly in the last year or so, many indigenous people around the world have spoken up towards saying, like, what's this now? Now everybody's talking regeneration as if it's an invention of the white man. No, it's a coming back to a deep knowledge. We do need to come back to understanding that we're all indigenous to life, that we are life. Like, again, that's where we can overcome this indigeneity issue, is when we speak of us as life and not as any separations that we've created on top of that as ways of naming. In that space, all expressions all around the world of indigenous people have the same 3 core questions that they ask themselves with every major decision that they're making. Does it serve myself? Does it serve my community? And does it serve life? And what's interesting for some people in the do-gooder worlds of, when I talk to social activists and my NGO friends and stuff, the first question currently for those people who in spiral dynamics terms have moved around green and yellow and so on, it becomes very difficult to ask the question, does it serve myself? And everybody's talking about this pendulum swing from the ego to the eco. Well, there's a healthy expression of self, call it ego, that actually is in service to life. And it's, again, this notion of nested wholeness says that we can only really be in service to ourselves, in service to a larger context. And I think that's what these 3 levels of questions of indigenous people all around the world speak to. Does it serve myself? Does it serve my community? Does it serve life? It's immediate, embodied, participatory. It's community, social, context specific, and it's planetary. We've always had it there as the core pattern that we need to realign to. And I guess that's where, like, if you ask me, what do I want to leave you with? That's that. But I would love to have a longer conversation. And actually, thank you so much for framing this with the way that Fiona put it together. It's a real gift to receive what you wrote together.
Thank you. A great sum up.
And I did, just for those who are still here, for me, it's been really interesting doing this, because I've been packing boxes and moving, and I've planted 2 apricot trees, 2 pomegranate trees, 3 cherry trees, an apple tree, and an avocado tree last week. And I've been completely disconnected from the computer world for a while. So this was a kind of brief diving in, and tomorrow the removal van comes and I finally move on to a piece of land. Do some regeneration.